A very good morning to one and all. Today we are going to talk about the topic Perthes disease. So this presentation I have made in such a way that it will be useful for the final year postgraduates as well as it will be easy on for you in future also to how to manage a case with Perthes disease. The three gentlemen towards my left are Lake, Clavey and Perthes. All the three independently described about Perthes disease in the year 1910. And as you all know, the other name for Perthes disease is Lake Clavey-Perthes disease. And the gentleman towards my right hand corner is Dr. Benjamin Joseph, my beloved professor. He has made a remarkable contributions in Perthes disease, and he is now currently the president of International Perthes Association. So, what I'll just give a gist of what we are going to deal today. First, we will see what is the definition for Perthes, history and incidence. We will also see the anatomy part, which is very important in Perthes, with a role on etiology and pathogenesis. We will also go through the clinical features and investigations. Next comes the most important part, the classification and the protocol and management of Perthes disease. Definition. You know that Perthes disease is affecting the head of the femur. It is actually changes in the capital femoral epiphysis, which is mainly due to loss of blood supply, which can be temporary to the femoral head. And this causes a avascular necrosis of femoral capital epiphysis. This can be of varying degree and severity. Following avascular necrosis, what you have to understand is definitely there will be reossification, which usually occurs. And this is an important time that we need to intervene in Perthes disease. If we don't intervene, this can lead to permanent femoral head deformity and may lead to premature osteoarthritis. So this, I think, can define a Perthes in a wholesome manner than in a one or two words of definition. Coming to the history, the first person to identify such a thing exists is Hugo van Thomas in 1876. What he observed is that this condition usually have a tendency to recover gradually, like more than 50 to 60% usually recovers without any problem. That's what he found out. And in 1890, Riddle first described this as an osteochondritis dissecans of femur head. In 1909, Walderstorm radiological classification was given, but then he thought that as tuberculosis initially. Later, he corrected and then gave it as the Perthes classification in 1922. As I already mentioned, in 1910, Legg in Boston, Clavey in France and Perthes in Germany described this disease separately, and then they recognized this as a separate entity. Coming to the incidence. So in incidence, usually it affects between age group of 3 to 10 years, and the peak age is usually at 6 years. Males are the predominantly persons who are affected, and it is about 4:1 ratio. Bilateral Perthes, even though is rare, about 3 to 5% is present. Let us come to the Indian scenario. This is very, very important because for nearly 6 decades, we were thinking that in India also Perthes exists like this. But Indian perspective of Perthes is totally different. What you have to understand is the onset of Perthes in Indian population is on an average 5 years, and usually it goes up to 12 years. And peak age of incidence is usually 8 years compared to that of 6 years to the Western population. And females are involved more. Around 30% of the Perthes disease that we see is females, and their prognosis was also poor, which were given by the studies of Perthes disease and then already published. So you know that Perthes disease can also be called as an osteochondritis deformans juvenalis osteochondritis of hip, pseudocoxalgia, or coxa plana. So these are the various synonyms that is given for the Perthes disease. Next is the anatomy. This is one thing that you have to understand very clearly. At birth and up to 4 years of age, you have 3 different blood supply to the head of the femur. One is the epiphyseal vessels, which is from the medial and lateral circumflex femoral artery, which transverses the retinacular and then gives the blood supply. The other is the metaphyseal vessels. This usually passes through the physis and then supplies the head of the femur. And the negligible amount is from the ligamentum teres, that foveal vessels. What happens at 4 years is that as the epiphysis grows, you don't have the metaphyseal blood supply to the epiphyseal head of the femur, and by at critical period of 4 to 7 years, the entire blood supply to the epiphysis is predominantly by a lateral epiphyseal artery, which is a branch of medial circumflex femoral artery. So this single artery supplies the head of the femur in this particular period. Then again, after 7 to 10 years, what you see is the ligamentum teres vessels become little bit more prominent, and then there is a cross connection or anastomosis between the lateral epiphyseal vessels. So this critical period is the period where usually you get this Perthes disease. So here just an anatomy to again enforce you like how the blood supply is given to the head of the femur by the predominantly by the lateral epiphyseal vessels, which enters the retinacular vessels, which enters the head of the femur. Now, you know that there is a blood supply loss that is happening, and that is causing the avascular necrosis. So how this blood supply loss is happened? This is given by 2 people as 2 different theories. One is by the Tureta's theory and other is a Caffey's theory. Tureta's theory states that it is mostly an extracapsular thing that is happening. Usually, as you know, that is a single blood supply, and the blood supply is by the retinacular vessels. So any blood supply loss by strong external rotators or any muscle blood supply loss can cause this avascular necrosis. Whereas Caffey is stating that it is predominantly the venous stasis because of that causes ischemia, and it is due to the intraepiphyseal compression of the blood supply. So these are the 2 different hypotheses that is given for avascular necrosis happening. Apart from that, there are various other theories that are given, like it could be a traumatic event, or it could be an inflammatory process, or it can be due to thrombophilia or insulin-like growth factor pathway abnormality, and the collagen type 2 mutation. So all these are the other theories that is usually given in that. And even maternal smoking, which is common in the Western population, or paternal smoking in our population, this can also influence by vasoconstriction and can cause Perthes disease. Coming to the etiology. Etiology, you have to understand that this is a multifactorial disease. There is no specific etiology as on date, but various associations have been found for genetic, developmental, and environmental factors. Coming to genetics, what we see is that if your parents are having Perthes, there is around 2 to 20% increased incidence in their siblings, or in their and in Indian population, it stands around 15%. And elderly parents have high incidence of getting a Perthes child. And as you know, males are more commonly infected. And what you again see is with low birth weight or abnormal birth presentation, like breech presentation, have high incidence of Perthes disease. When we are coming to abnormal growth and development, what we have seen is that the bone age of the persons who are affected with Perthes is usually 1 to 3 years lesser than that of the chronological age in these children, and around 2 years is what is found to be in Indian population. And these children are seemingly to be smaller than that of their co-peers. And other important things like coagulation disorders are usually associated with them, and these children found to be ADHD. Other environmental factors that you have to keep in mind is that these children usually come from lower socioeconomic status, which is more common in India, or it can be because of any local burn trauma. As I already told, smoking has been associated with the incidence of Perthes children in the children. Apart from that, urinary tract infection has also been correlated with increased urinary tract infection. You can land up in Perthes, or trace metal deficiency is also been associated. Coming to pathogenesis, what you have to understand is there is a repeated bout of ischemia or infraction to the femoral head, which can lead to a pathological fractures. You all know that this, because now the pathogenesis predominantly states that both venous stasis and intraosseous pressure both contribute to the infarction, and finally it leads to the necrosis of the epiphysis. So what happens to the femur head, why it deforms? This is mainly because of three important factors. One, the mechanical properties of articular cartilage and bone is decreased, and second, the pathological repair process itself is little bit delayed, and there is growth arrest of the spherical growth plate, which leads to an asymmetrical restoration of the femur head, which could be better seen in this flow chart. So as you see, first there is a loss of blood supply to the articular cartilage, which leads to necrosis of the leaf layer, and then there is increased vascular endothelial growth factors and other factors, which leads to cartilage vascularization, and if the growth is not happening properly, then it may lead to deformity. The same thing happens to the bony epiphysis. So here also there is an extensive cell death, and what you see is an increased bone mineral content, which is and leading to an increased bone absorption. Because there is increased bone resorption and there is delayed bone formation, the mechanical strength of the femur head is decreased, which leads to the deformation, because you know that hip is a weight bearing joint, and when the head of the femur is not mechanically stable enough to take over the weight, it leads to the bony deformation. Physis, usually there is a growth arrest in the physis, which can lead to either coxa vara or coxa breva. So this diagram typically depicts what's happening in the epiphysis, where you can see that there is a loss of blood supply in the affected site, and osteoclasts are increased, and there is bony necrosis and resorption of bone that is happening, which leads to the bony deformity in Perthes. Clinically, this can be given in 4 stages, which is a synovitis stage, a stage of avascular necrosis, a stage of fragmentation, and healed and residual stage. So this incipient stage of synovitis usually happens in 1 to 3 weeks of age. And what you see is that there is an inflamed synovium, and the joint fluid might be increased. But if you tap the joint fluid, there will not be any inflammatory cells, which is a diagnostic of Perthes disease. In stage of avascular necrosis, which usually takes 6 months to 1 year, here the portion of ossific nucleus is usually affected, and usually the anterior or entire nucleus can be affected. And you know that there is bone trabecula or crushed, but this avascular necrosis, when it is happening, the femur head appears to be normal in the X-rays. Later, it becomes little bit sclerotic, and then it goes into the next stage of fragmentation and regeneration. This stage usually takes 2 to 3 years, where there is a resorption of the necrotic bone, which is slowly replaced by a viable bone, which is because that as after some time, there is the blood supply is restored to the head of the femur, and viable new bone usually forms. And final is the healed or residual stage, in which the new bone completely replaces the necrotic bone. But at that time, it's because of excessive pressure what happens is that the ossific nucleus usually gets deformed and then it forms a mushroom shaped contour, which can lead to oxa magna. And the other important problem that you have to understand is that here there are two physes in the proximal femur. One is the epiphysis of head of the femur and other is the greater trochanter. There is blood supply which is affected to one physis, and because of hyperemic blood supply to the rest of the part, the other physis grows little bit more, that is the greater trochanter grows more, and this can cause various other problems in future. So greater trochanter hypertrophy is also the other problem that we have to look in case of Perthes disease. Coming to the clinical features, I think most of the things we have already told, but few things I need to highlight in that. You know that it is usually a male 4 to 8 years, smaller than his counterparts. But most important thing in Perthes, what I will need to say is, first thing is, it usually starts as a painless limp. In Perthes, usually the child comes with limping, and usually limping starts before the onset of pain. This is one important characteristic of Perthes. And the other important thing that we commonly see is they may isolately present with pain in the knee and there is no pain in the hip, the radiated pain. So always, whenever you are seeing children in this age group who are coming with pain in the knee, kindly always examine the hip. They may be having clinical examination features in the hip joint, but they will be solely presenting with knee pain. Okay, and it is usually aggravated by activity and then relieved by rest. And this pain can be either continuous or it can be of intermittent nature. As I already told, around 4% of children affected with Perthes disease have a urogenital anomaly. So that is one thing that you have to look out at. And that's why the reason why urinary tract infections are being correlated with occurrence of Perthes disease. Clinically, there is a limb length discrepancy. There is a mild muscle wasting initially starting in the gluteal region, and in advanced stages, what you see is the proximal thigh muscles are also wasted. Then initially what you see in restriction of motions is that initially the joint is irritable, there is effusion, and you get features of synovitis and deformity like a synovitis. And later what happens is that there is a restriction of movement, especially abduction and internal rotation. Sometimes flexion or adduction contracture can also develop. Gait, as far as gait is concerned, the child usually presents with antalgic gait initially, and in later stages, they usually present with Trendelenburg test, Trendelenburg gait. Adults, usually they present with degenerative arthritis. Coming to the diagnosis part, the first thing that you have to do is the routine blood investigation. Especially you have to see if the child is having sickle cell anemia, hemophilia, or any coagulation disorders that you have to always rule out in Perthes disease. And other important investigations, other routine blood investigations are also very much needed, because when we come to differential diagnosis, it could be like malignancy or anything can be associated with that, which we will discuss later. Next, coming to the X-rays. X-rays, initially, only you will see subtle changes like a widening of joint space or asymmetry in the ossific nucleus. Generally, you have to compare with the opposite side. In initial stages, what you see is just a decrease in the height of the epiphysis and nothing else. So you have to be very careful enough to find out this. And later, when it is going to necrotic and fragmentation phase, you can see a sclerosis and then fragmentation of the epiphysis. Crescent sign is best seen in the lateral view. It is basically, you see a small lucent area in the subchondral region of the bone. Okay, and in reossification phase, you see an increased epiphyseal activity. So this line diagram I have given so that I can explain you in better way of all the changes that you're seen in various stages in Perthes disease that you have to look for in case of Perthes X-ray is being given to you for discussion. So that's the reason why I have given this. So the first is the Waldenstone sign. Waldenstone sign is basically because it is increased in the joint space, that is usually medial joint space that is happening. Either this can happen in case of effusion or in case of chondral this is coming this. Yeah. Sorry for the trouble. So Waldenstrom sign is increased joint space. It can be because of increased in the fluid, or it is because of the chondral ossification that is happening. This can happen. And the second thing is there is a bulging of joint capsule, which is usually seen in the lateral part, which you have to see. And third point is that you can see a rarefication in the lateral part of the metaphysis. So this is one finding that you can see in case of Perthes disease. And fourth is the crescent sign, which is usually a small strip of subchondral lucent area, which is seen in the epiphysis. And the fifth is the gauge sign, which is usually seen in the lateral part of the epiphysis, where you see a V-shaped defect. So this is the place where you have to see for a gauge sign. And what you see is that there is a band of osteoporosis, which is usually seen in the metaphysis, which is close to the epiphyseal region. And these are called as the metaphyseal cyst. And metaphyseal cyst, you have to look in this area. There can be another finding, like translucent area can also be seen in the medial epiphyseal zone. Apart from that, there can be some changes usually seen in the roof of the acetabulum, which you have to recognize in case of a Perthes disease. And you all know that the height of the epiphysis per se can be decreased and it can be sclerosed. And the other things you have to understand is, because there is loss of blood supply, there is some increased blood supply to the surrounding area, which can show as a clinical feature, radiological features of by increasing in the neck of the femur or widening of the teardrop and thickening of the physeal plate. So these are the 12 findings that you have to see, and which can be present in various stages in case of Perthes disease. So this is a collection of X-rays that I have just want to show you the various features, how it look like in X-rays. So this is like a stage 1, where you can see by comparing the opposite side, the physeal height is decreased. And here you can see the soft tissue shadow. The capsule is distended. This is one thing. And again, you can see metaphyseal cyst, which is present. And you can see there is fragmentation that is happening in this X-ray. And other important finding is there is some rarefication changes that is happening in the acetabular region. In this X-ray, you can see that the physeal height is completely decreased. And here you can see a crescent sign, even though it is not so clear, but you can just see that there is a crescent sign is there. And here you can see the V-shaped defect in the, which is the gauge sign, which can be seen clearly in this X-ray. Here, this X-ray I have given mainly to show, see there is a widening of the metaphysis comparing to that of the opposite side, which you can appreciate in this X-ray. And you can see there is small reossification that is happening at the peripheral part. This is also called as the extrusion, which plays this finding plays an important role when it comes to the management part of the Perthes disease. And in this, I have shown you there is slowly the reossification happening around, covering up to 1/3 of the physis. And here you can see that the reossification is happening on both sides. With the center, there is a lucent area. So this is still more advanced stage in Perthes disease. And here, this is a treated Perthes, and it is a healed Perthes. You can see a little bit of coxa magna is present compared to that of the opposite side, but the head is looking very much fine. So even though X-rays plays the important role in Perthes disease, there are also other investigations that can help us in Perthes disease, which is very important when you give for exams. Like MRI can be done to show that there is evidence, if there is any evidence of marrow necrosis. And recent studies are now evolving around MRI, especially MRI angiogram, to see how much of the head is affected, because if more than 50% of the epiphysis is involved, they say recent advocate is to go for an earlier containment of the hip to get better results. So nowadays, it is becoming slowly a protocol is being formed to do a MRI angiography in case of Perthes disease. Apart from that, bone scan also be done, in which there is a reduced uptake in case of early part of the disease and increased uptake in later part of the disease. Ultrasound can show you the joint effusion, and we can do arthrogram which can show you the congruity of the head and if there is any head deformity is present. Coming to the classifications, you have to understand that there are 4 different classifications that is expected from you in case of exam purpose. One is an Waldenstrom classification, other is a Catarrhal classification, the other is the Salter-Thompson classification. The reason for different, and the Herring's classification. The reason for all these different classifications is each has its own significance, and that's why it is expected from you to write all the 4 different classifications. These are the 4 classifications when the disease is present in the active stage. And there is one more classification called as Stulberg classification, which I will be discussing after this classification. That classification is mainly for saying the prognosis, and this classification should be applied only after complete healing of the disease. After stage 4, complete healing happens, then you can apply the Stulberg classification. Kindly never ever comment about Stulberg classification if the disease is in active stage, because that will lead to disaster. So always this 4 classification is when the disease is in active stage, and the Stulberg classification is when the disease is in when it is healed stage. So coming to Waldenstrom classification, there are 4 stages, which we have discussed in the radiology and other parts. The initial stage where there is a bony necrosis is happening. Later, avascular necrosis is happening, which is usually 6 months. Then it goes for the fragmentation phase, where you see increased lucency and sclerosis, which is usually affecting the lateral and the medial area, and here collapse usually happens, and fragmentation of the epiphysis usually happens. Then the 3rd stage, this is the reossification phase, in which new subchondral bone usually forms, and the flattening of the epiphysis usually improves in this stage, in this phase, and it is usually around 3 to 5 years. And final is the residual phase. In this there is no change in the bone density, and the shape of the head usually remains same. Then comes to the Catarrhal classification. Catarrhal classification says what part of the head is usually affected. So in this, group 1 is usually less than 50% of the head is involved, and mostly the anterior part is involved. And one more point I need to emphasize is that whenever you are given a Perthes X-ray and then you are asked to classify or about comment on classification or stage of the disease, kindly ask for both the views, AP and frog lateral views, before commenting on the stage of the disease. Because if the classification cannot be achieved without seeing the 2 views, okay? And in group 2, what you see is that half of the nucleus is become sclerotic, or there is a collapse in the central part of the and Catarrhal 3 is there is mostly more than 50% is involved, and there can be metaphyseal resorption can also be present. In group 4, the whole head or ossific nucleus usually becomes flat and there is a marked metaphyseal reaction can be present. So to make it very simple, catarrhal is type 1 is less than 50%, type 2 is around 50%, type 3 is more than 50%, and type 4 is entire epiphysis. So that's how, what is important is that catarrhal classification is only applicable after fragmentation has occurred. So don't comment on catarrhal classification when you are given a stage 1 Perthes disease X-ray. And this classification also have a poor interobservable reproducibility. Then the third important classification is the Herring's classification. It has a greater predictive outcome and it is based on the height of the lateral pillar. So the head of the epiphysis is divided into 3 columns and the lateral pillar is the height is considered in this classification. So type A is the height is normal, type B is less than 50% and type C is more than 50%. This has some prognostic features, prognostic value in case of this classification. Next, the final one is that to see the extent of epiphyseal involvement. So this is given by Salter and Harris, and this is given in 2 types, same like less than 50% and more than 50%. Same like catarrhal, because it is involving the amount of epiphysis, this can be applicable only before any fragmentation is usually happening. Once fragmentation happening, you cannot apply this classification. So this is one thing which examiners may be fond of asking. So this you have to know. The catarrhal on 1982 gave this head-at risk sign. So there are 5 different things that is called as head-at risk sign. It is lateral subluxation and speculed calcification occurring at the lateral part of the capital epiphysis, a diffuse metaphyseal reaction, that is the metaphyseal cyst, horizontal physis, and the gauge sign, which I have already explained, the lateral V-shaped defect in the lateral epiphysis. But to be more frank with you, catarrhal head-at risk sign has no role in predicting the risk factor of the head, even though few examiners don't agree with that. So that's why I have given the quote, you learn, unlearn, and then relearn. So for exam purpose, please mention this as head-at risk sign. Do not contradict with the examiner, but just look into this head-at risk sign. You know what is the problem with this head-at risk sign. Here you see lateral subluxation, which usually happens after the newborn formation happening at the medial side of the epiphysis, which means that it is already in stage 3, which means the head is already damaged. So there is no use in saying that head is at risk, it is already gone. And same way, speckled calcification at the lateral part of the capital epiphysis means there is more than 1/3 of the epiphysis, there is reossification has happened, which means again the stage 3 has been crossed. So the head is completely damaged. So there is no use in that it is head at risk. So these two are saying it as stage 3. And the third and fourth, which is metaphyseal cyst and horizontal physis, which usually happens in stage 1 and 2. So, and the fifth is gauge sign, which has no prognostic or diagnostic significance in case of Perthes disease. So combining stage 1 and stage 3 in 5 points and then saying this as a head-at risk sign is not going to give you in any prognostic or diagnostic value about the prognosis of head of the femur. So it is of no use in saying about the catarrhal head-at risk sign. And finally, I would like to tell about the Stulberg's criteria for prognosis. As I already told, this has to be applied only when the complete healing stage 4 happens, then you have to apply this. So here what you see is, if you see a spherical congruency of the head of the femur, then most likely you get a normal hip joint and the prognosis is good. Whereas if you have one of the following, like a coxa magna or a steep acetabulum or a short neck, then and your damage to the head is less than 2 mm, you can always get away with a good head, and the prognosis is again good. Then comes the stage 3, which is also called as the ovoid head, in which you have aspherical congruency of more than 2 mm. So you end up in coxa magna, coxa breva, and a steep acetabulum. Here you end up in mild to moderate arthritis, whereas the stage 4 you have a aspherical congruency. This is very important. When your head neck is damaged, even if your acetabulum is damaged, both the surfaces are aspherical, and what you finally end is only a mild to moderate arthritis. Whereas the fifth one, even though the acetabulum is looking normal and there is there is a damage to the epiphysis or aspherical head is present, then this may lead to a very poor prognosis and a severe arthritis. So coming to the differential diagnosis, as a initially transient synovitis can look like a Perthes disease in initial stages. SCFE in initial stages can also look like a Perthes disease. Septic arthritis and tuberculosis, initially in older days, tuberculosis and Perthes disease, there was always a confusion. And sickle cell anemia, hemophilia can also be a differential diagnosis for Perthes disease, because Perthes disease is usually a single event, usually happening in a particular age group, whereas sickle cell anemia and hemophilia, usually they tend to have repeated episodes of avascular necrosis and repeated stages of healing. So those cannot be coming under into the Perthes disease. Apart from that, Gaucher's, spondyloepiphyseal dysplasia, and multiple metaphyseal dysplasia, all these X-rays can also present to you like Perthes disease. But what you see is the bilateral involvement in those cases goes to 50 to 60%, whereas in Perthes disease it is hardly 3 to 7%. Coming to the management. So most important thing in management is what we are having an objective. Objective is, you know that this is a disease in which the healing happens, and then this process happens naturally. But what is the only thing that we need to intervene is, one, to preserve the sphericity of the femoral head. That is the most important thing. And we have to try to reduce the risk of stiffness and degenerative arthritis. And also, we have to preserve the emotional well-being of the children. This is important because in earlier days, before these containment surgeries, the Perthes children were put on braces, and then they were left to move around for years together with that brace. So it was an emotional trauma to those children, where especially affecting age group is between 4 to 8 years, where the children tend to play around so much, and then you are restricting them for a prolonged period of time. So these are the objectives that we are trying to achieve while achieving the spherical femoral head. So Yeah, now can you hear? Can you hear me? Can participants hear me? Okay. In stage 2B, in stage 2B, kindly I request the participant to unmute their audio. Mute their audio, please. In stage 2B, the fragmentation is advanced. That is, there is no new bone formation, but you see there is a advanced fragmentation. Stage 2A is there is just the fragmentation has just begun, and what you see is one or two vertical fissures that is usually present, like this. One or two vertical fissures usually present, whereas in stage 2B you have increased number of fissure and the fragmentation is advanced. In stage 3A, what you see is new bone formation in the lateral part of the epiphysis, and usually it is involving less than 1/3. Whereas in stage 3B, what you see is the new bone formation covers more than 1/3 of the width of the epiphysis. Stage 4 is healing is complete and there is no radiological evidence of avascular bone. So with these 5 things in mind, now we will plan for according to age and everything. First, if the child is less than 5 years, then there is no need for any surgical containment, even if there is any extrusion is present. Whereas in stage 5 to 7 years, when you see extrusion, then it means that you need to contain the hip. In 7 to 12 years, even before extrusion is happening, you have to go for containment. And over 12 years, basically, you get a, hello, sir. You get a poor and you do not consider for containment. Just the Dwara call. And in case of stages, stage 1A, 1B, and 2A, we can consider for containment. And stage 2B, there is a question mark in the containment of the surgery. And stage 3A, 3B, and 4, we do not consider for containment because these are all advanced stages. And considering the movement of the hip, in all movements has to be if all movements are restored, then we can go for a varus derotation osteotomy. If internal rotation alone is restricted, we can go for a varus and a extension osteotomy. If abduction and internal rotation both are restricted, do not consider containment. So why this is important? Because what we have found through various researches is the odds ratio of obtaining a spherical head
வாயில பிஏபி போட்டுருவாங்க பரவாயில்லையா அப்படின்னு.
So odds ratio of obtaining a spherical head is 60 times higher when a surgery is done before the stage 2B. So considering all these 5 variables, now we can formulate a protocol of when to contain and when to not to contain for a surgical or when we have to go for non-surgical containment. So if the age is more than 7 years, or if the age is less than 7 years with extrusion, we have to go for surgical containment. Whereas when the age is less than 7 years and without any extrusion, there is no need for the surgical containment. And extent of involvement, if the physis, half or more of the physis is involved, then you have to go for a surgical containment. And if less than half is involved, then there is no need for a surgical containment. As I already told, stage 1, 1A, 1B, 2A, we can go for a surgical containment. The 2B, there is still a question mark is there. If you go for a 2B surgical containment, the results are not so great. Whereas 3A, 3B, and 4, directly we no need to go for surgical containment because you don't get a good hip even when you do a surgery. And when extrusion is present in children, when the onset of the disease is less than 12 years, or if the extrusion is absent at 7 to 12 years, you can go for a surgical containment. If extrusion is absent and the age is less than 7 years, there is no need for going for a surgical containment of hip, and this can when it comes to non-operative management, first important thing is observation, activity restriction, traction, and physiotherapy is usually given. Bed rest with skin traction until synovitis subside is usually followed. And once the range of motion regains, we can plan for bracing. Whenever we apply brace, usually the brace is applied at around 45 degree of abduction and in slight internal rotation. Usually you should have more than 10 degree of free movement of maximal abduction to be present. Like if your abduction is around 55 degree, you can put it in 45 degree. But if the child abduction is only 45 degree, you have to keep it in around 35 degree. And the child is usually encouraged to walk with this. So this is the brace that is usually given. And usually the bed brace is been allowed at the bedtime, and they are asked for exercises. You have to give a frequent follow-up, and once you see a new layer of subchondral bone that is formed radiologically, you can discontinue the brace. Contraindication is usually an incompliant or unacceptable patient, and if there is a bilateral involvement, it's then the child has to wear for a prolonged period of time. Hence, it is usually not advised. Disadvantages are there is a restriction in the ambulation, and there is stiffness of the other uninvolved joints like knee and ankle. The other thing that if there is a range of motion is restricted, then what is usually advised is that we can put a Petrie's cast or a broomstick cast under anesthesia, same like abduction of around 45 degree and internal rotation. If there is a significant loss of motion or there is lateral subluxation, then we have to go for a close reduction, adductor tenotomy and a Petrie's cast. Then we are coming to the surgical containment. The most commonly performed surgery is a varus derotation osteotomy. This is a subtrochanteric osteotomy, which is usually done, and the usual surgery type of surgery that is performed is a lateral open wedge osteotomy. In this, the femoral anteversion and rotations are usually corrected, and usually the distal fragment is fixed little bit in external rotation, so that you get the while the child starts walking, the child starts the medial rotation of the head of the femur usually occurs. So that's how the principle of surgery works. And what are the advantages is that and how we usually do a varus derotation osteotomy is we take a usual DCP plate, we pre-bend it to about 20 degrees, and because usual neck shaft angle will be around 140 to 145 degree in this age group. So we should not get into coxa vara, so we should not go less than 120 degrees. So a 20-degree pre-bend plate is taken, and a lateral open wedge osteotomy is usually performed. Advantage is that it seats the head deeply in the acetabulum, and then it removes the vulnerable anterior and lateral portion of the head from the acetabular edge, so that there is no deformation of the head that usually happens. It decreases the joint reaction forces. Other disadvantages, sometimes we can go into excessive varus. If you don't do a pre-bent plate, we try to correct it, you can go for excessive varus. Definitely, there will be limb shortening, and Trendelenburg gait will persist in these children. And other complications like non-union can happen in these children, which is actually very rare. But the other disadvantage is that these children usually will go for a secondary surgery for hardware removal. So we are subjecting a child to one more surgery. So that is one more disadvantages of varus derotation osteotomy. If we are not correcting the problem in the hip, in the femur, then we can go to the pelvis and then correct it. This we can do by doing a innominate osteotomy like a Pemberton or a Salter osteotomy. The advantage is that you can get an anterolateral coverage, and because in Perthes disease there is a growth disturbance is there. In innominate osteotomy you get lengthening of the extremity, so in which it is balanced, so in way it is advantage, and there is no need for a secondary surgery. But disadvantages include there can be, you cannot sometimes when you correct a pelvis, correct a proper containment can be achieved, and there can be increased in the joint pressure. So this is how Pemberton or Salter innominate osteotomy is usually performed, in which you can see that there is a osteotomy cut made above the acetabulum, and then slowly it brings down. This sagittal view will give you a better idea of how this surgery is done. So by doing osteotomy, you bring it down and gets the containment of the head of the femur, and this empty space is filled with bone graft and fixed with K wires or screws. The other pelvic procedure that we can do is a shelf procedure, in which a tectum of bone is removed from the ilium, and then it is kept as a shelf, or it is kept as a coverage, extending the coverage of the head of the femur. This is mostly done in older children, and here the shortening of limb usually persists, and this is primarily reserved as a salvage procedure in case of a Perthes disease osteotomies. So this diagram I have given you to understand what actually containment surgery we do. Here, this is how you see that there is a lateral subluxation of the femur is present, head is not contained, and the involved head is directly impinging on the head of the femur. So now by a varus derotation osteotomy, you keep the femur deep inside the acetabulum, and then relieving the pressure on the head of the femur, and by making sure that you get a round femur head. And in a innominate osteotomy, you see that again that lateral coverage of the head of the femur is improved by the osteotomy, and it is and bone graft is kept in between the osteotomy site. In shelf procedure, there is an interposition of capsule is kept, and then excess bone taken from the ileum is kept as a bone graft, and then the lateral coverage is improved. So these are the three different surgeries that you can do for a Perthes disease for containing. One more important concept, as I already told, there is a overgrowth of greater trochanter, which can be controlled by a greater trochanter epiphysiodesis. So what you have to understand is that when there is a growth of epiphysis and decreased growth of the head of the femur, what the auriclotrochanteric distance is decreased. In way, what happens is that effective abductor length is decreased, and which increases the joint reaction force. And by doing epiphysiodesis, we can control or arrest the growth of the greater trochanter. This is usually advised to do before 8 years of age. And after 8 years, the results are really not so great. Epiphysiodesis can be done with a screw, or we can do a epiphyseal plate can also be used, that I have shown in this images. Next, when coming to the residual deformities, what are the residual deformities that finally happens if the children is presenting to you at the latest? They can get a problem like hinge abduction, coxa breva can happen. As I told, trochanteric overgrowth can happen. Coxa irregularis, coxa plana with deformed head can happen. Femoroacetabular impingement can happen, and it can finally lead to early osteoarthritis. So whenever a child presents to you with these kind of deformities, then we have to go for salvage or reconstructive surgeries, which includes a valgus osteotomy, in which we do a valgus and an extension type of osteotomy. By doing a valgus osteotomy, we are actually increasing we are moving the greater trochanter laterally, which increases the abduction strength, as well as we can bring the affected part a little bit more anteriorly, so that the affected part doesn't go, and affected head weight bearing part usually moves away from the lateral edge of the acetabulum. And if there is a excess bone that is present outside the joint, but it is causing a hinge abduction, then we can do a chiliectomy. By using osteotome, you can remove the bone. So this is one more procedure. And when you get an incongruent hip, and when you see then you can go for a Chiari osteotomy, in which you do a osteotomy and then medially push the acetabulum so that you get a lateral coverage. So this is one of the salvage procedure that can be done. And when there is a decrease in the ATD and you have abductor deficiency is there, you can always go for a trochanteric advancement surgery, in which the greater trochanter is transferred distally and laterally. So these are the surgical options that is present for Perthes disease. Apart from that, there are newer strategies that has been nowadays devised mainly for anti-resorptive therapy, like denosumab has been one of the reagents that is inhibit osteoclastic formation. So that has been used, and bisphosphonates has also been trained in Perthes disease, even though the results are not so encouraging, but few people still do this. And intraosseous administration of bisphosphonates is also considered to be one of the newer strategies for Perthes disease. The idea is that they are trying to bypass the phase of fragmentation and then going for an early reossification phase. So take home message will be the most important thing is Perthes has a multifactorial etiology, and the most important thing is whenever you see the child in an early stage, like stage 1A, 2A or 1B, you can go for containment surgery. When it is advanced stage, there is no use in going for an containment surgery. Same way, as the age increases, if the child presents to you in less than 9 years, you usually get a better prognosis. Whereas when you get adolescent Perthes or more than 12 years, then the prognosis is poor. So we have to select the candidates who can do well with surgery, and we need to perform the surgery in case of Perthes disease than in going for containment surgery for all the children. Thank you. Now participant can unmute their audios and then they can ask if there are any questions. Any questions?
Sir, I have one question here.
You can talk here only. Ask. Don't talk, just ask here. No problem.
Sir, when we will consider total hip arthroplasty? Can I ask?
Yeah.
Sir, when we will consider
No, total hip arthroplasty is advised in these children, especially when you are having stage 5 of Stuhlberg. You know that these children are definitely going to have a very bad hip. They are going for early osteoarthritis. So these are the children are definitely candidates for total hip arthroplasty. But as on date, we need to wait till skeletal maturity till 18 or 20 years, and then if there are clinical symptoms like pain, severe restriction of movement, it is advised to go for a total hip arthroplasty. Without don't jump into going for total hip arthroplasty by just radiological features, because we see a subset of children who do have a very bad X-ray, but they are able to do their normal activities and not near normal, but they can able to do their usual routine activities. So I don't think so that these children has to be subjected to a very early arthroplasty of the hip. We can wait for the symptoms to develop, and when there are when the pain or severe restriction of movement happens, then we can go for total hip arthroplasty.
One more question.
So regarding can you hear me?
Yeah.
Regarding osteotomy, able to have two osteotomies: valgus derotation osteotomy and valgus extension osteotomy.
No, varus. It is not valgus.
Okay, varus derotation and varus extension.
So there are two osteotomies are present. One is the varus derotation osteotomy and varus extension osteotomy. These osteotomies are mainly performed. Participant in the class, please mute yourself. So in varus derotation osteotomy, this first the prerequisite for performing a varus derotation osteotomy is you should have full range of motion of hip. Without having full range of motion, never ever perform varus derotation osteotomy. What happens is that in varus derotation osteotomy, the idea is you have to bring the involved portion of the hip into and bring the uninvolved portion of the hip to the lateral part of the acetabulum, which is the weight bearing portion, so that the deformity that is happening is usually less. So to bring that, two things we are doing. One is varus. When you do varus, what happens is that the head of the femur goes deep into the acetabular cavity. In that way, the lateral part of the acetabulum directly does not give pressure to the supralateral portion or the usual part that is affected in the Perthes disease, and if and the deformity usually decreases. The other important thing is derotating the head. So that how we are doing this derotation, that is the important thing that you have to understand. Whenever you are fixing the osteotomy intraoperatively, you have to give 10 to 15 degree of external rotation and then fix the distal fragment. So the child, when he starts walking, what happens is that he will not walk with external rotation gait until and unless he is having movement restriction. That's the reason why we should make sure that he is having full internal rotation. So when you external rotate and then fix the plate, the child, when he starts walking, he will internal rotate to avoid the external rotation of the distal femur. In that way, the superior portion and the involved portion of the hip also rotates, and the uninvolved or unaffected parts become the new weight bearing portion. In that way, when the healing happens, you get a better molding of the head and a better spherical head. So that's how the varus derotation osteotomy works. When you know that the internal rotation cannot happen or internal rotation restriction is there, then what is advised is that just a varus and an extension osteotomy to be performed. When you do a varus extension osteotomy, the only advantage that you get is that you do varus and you keep the head in deep portion, and that is the only advantage, whereas the rotational component you usually don't get. Okay, so that is the two difference, and main reason for performing is the movements should be restored. If you are doing a varus derotation osteotomy in a child who is having movement restriction is there, then the child will walk like a Charlie Chaplin. He will be walking with external rotation gait. So never ever perform varus derotation until full range of motion is reached. Yeah, you have to keep in extension and then fix it. Okay, if there are no more doubts, okay, that's a good question. So actually this brace treatment is usually not now followed. So in my perspective, this brace has become nowadays obsolete. So what instead they are saying is put them in non-weight bearing, okay, or a broomstick cast for 6 weeks or 3 months. By that phase, usually they bypass the fragmentation phase and then they go for a healing phase. So this broomstick cast for 3 months is usually done in case of younger children. Whereas when you are left with the older children, it is always better to contain the hip if it is in early stages. And if it is later stages, it is better to go for a masterly neglect, because you contain it with a brace or with surgery, you are not going to get a good result. You have to wait how the disease progresses. And only thing that we can advise them is non-weight bearing gait. So that's the restriction of activities on non-weight bearing gait. If you want to use, if there are any specific indication, like if the child is less than 5 years, and even after 3 months of broomstick casting, still the reossification phase has not started, then it is better to put the child on brace. And the advice is usually 12 hours of brace wearing, and during sleep, brace is not advised. And when the child is awake, it is advised to wear brace. And usually the X-rays are taken at month interval and see for reossification. So it's again the stage that decides whether we need to stop or not. Once you go to stage 3B, that is where reossification is happening in more than 1/3 of the epiphysis, then we can safely discontinue the brace and we can wait for 1 more month for full reossification to occur, and then you can ask the child to wait back. And one important thing that I forgot to tell you is whenever you do a femoral containment surgery, we actually bypass the fragmentation phase. In usually it decreases to 1 or 2 months, and directly it goes for reossification phase. So that is because of you do a osteotomy and then there is excessive vascular supply. So that is one more reason for increased vascularity and healing in when you do a containment surgery. So if there are no more doubts, we will wind up the session. Thank everyone for actively participating.